name is Anthony Hendrickson, Anthony Joseph Hendrickson. I know I go under the name of Anthony Saltus Hendrickson since I've been married. Most people know me as Tony. My name I resisted for a number of years since I started in the way of life. I was born in Cardiff, in the old St David's Hospital. I was the third of 4 children. My parents came from the Caribbean, and after a year we moved to Llanrymni, and I spent all my childhood years schooling and the informal education in Llanrymni. I was born to Afro-Caribbean parents. My parents came from two tiny islands in the Leeward Islands called St Kitts and Nevis. And I'm the third of 4 children. I got 3 sisters. My first memory, interesting enough, was preschool. I must have been about 3 years old, and I was playing with my sister in the house, and my mum, we normally went up to pick my sister up from school, or some neighbours would bring her home. On that day, some neighbours were bringing her home, and for some reason, well, not for some reason, the clouds came over. It was about lunchtime, and it got very, very dark, and that kind of it was quite, something that really stuck with me. It got very, very dark. And we ended up having a thunderstorm, and it was very, very heavy. Really a lot of rain, and my front garden got flooded, and the neighbours actually banded together with buckets and things to actually take the water out of my garden. So that's my first real memory. Very mixed. I was brought up in an area which wasn't overly diverse, Llanrymni, in the 60s and in the 70s. And so we did feel as if we stood out, and I'm sure we did. That was the reality of living in an area like Llanrymni at the time. We were other Afro-Caribbean families in the area, as well as some other races as well. But we did have friends from some of my friends from islands of origin. Some people from St Kitts and Nevis, but also from other Caribbean islands. But it was a challenging time. I think the way race was dealt with at that time was not a lot was really addressed. So you're constantly dealing with reactions and people's perceptions in a way that you probably don't get. Well, it's still around. Clearly still around, but it's a different dimension then at that time. And we didn't have the world view, I suppose, we have now. So we dealt with a lot of reactionary prejudice at home. I mean, I say home in my, in terms of my friends and neighbours, in my school life. So there was that side to my upbringing, but there's another side which I remember being quite free and open, in a sense that I was brought up in an era where, come the summer holidays or any holiday, we'd be out for the day. Me and my friends would get together, and whatever game we were playing, we'd be off. We'd be off in the fields or wherever. After that, I don't ever remember feeling unsafe in the way I think people would feel unsafe now. I see where parents feel unsafe with to let their children roam there. And we went, over substantial distances through fields and woods. Sometimes we just go to the local field and play football all day. I remember even in the winter, going out and playing football in the street. Cars that come past, there wasn't as many cars on the road, nowhere near as much cars on the road at the time. So you play in the street, and the car would come past, and we'd move aside, maybe move our jumpers out of the way with the goalposts. The car would go by, and we put it back out. We'd rush inside and warm our hands up a little bit, and then come back out and play. Do you see what I mean? And it wasn't until it was slightly dark, the parents would come out and say, well, and call you, or when it was meal times. So there was a real element of fun and freedom. But there was this cloud, I suppose. I think it's fair to say there was a cloud hanging over us in terms of how we were treated sometimes and perceived locally. Yeah, I mean, it's quite a lot actually in school. And I suppose some of it was from children, and I'm not sure how. I'm sure a lot of it wasn't overly informed. It was just the way children pick things up and repeat what they've heard from other people. In some cases, what they repeated, what they heard on television. And I'm sure a lot of it wasn't particularly hate-filled. It was just young people picking up and copying the behaviours of older people. I was brought up in the era of Love Thy Neighbour. I remember name calling escalating after that came out, you know. But there were people, and there were children who seemed to be very, very vindictive. And if they were in a group of people who were rallying around them, then they could actually mobilise a degree of bullying around you. There were some very uninformed and uninformed teachers who were explicit in their racism in a way I suspect they wouldn't be as happy to be now. So, there was some very explicit and very clear discrimination, because sometimes we can talk about things being unintentional or people not meaning particular things. I did have some experiences where teachers were intentionally spiteful and prejudiced, towards myself and other black pupils. And that was, I think, probably a sign of the times as well. It was obviously it shaped me, in terms of how I responded to people in society around that time. My parents survived. They were surviving, really. I think they came to the UK really just to make a home for their family. My dad worked a lot of hours. At times he worked shift. I remember him, going out early in the morning and coming home, quite late. He worked in industry. And my mum was a traditional mum in terms of she stayed home and looked after the children. And I think they had a lot of baggage themselves they had to deal with in terms of how they were treated. And my parents were the kind of people who really didn't want to make a fuss, and I think they didn't want us to make a fuss at all. So I think as long as we kept our nose clean, they were reasonably happy. They weren't particularly aspiring for us in terms of I want you to be, a doctor or a teacher or anything like that. But they clearly, expected us to go out and work and make a contribution. And to a large degree, they were successful. Like I said, I have 3 sisters and myself, and none of us really got involved in anything wayward. I have to say, we were more, I think, fearful of what would happen with my parents rather than the police or, wider society. So there was a degree of, discipline in the house. But I wouldn't say they were aspiring for us, other than to work hard and keep our nose clean. I left school with not a lot of qualifications. I think it's fair to say I underachieved. I think I was one of those young people who did, pretty well in comprehensive school days, and even in the early years, my first 2 years of comprehensive school, my grades were pretty high. But then, I can plot now as an adult, the decline, and also the decline kind of went with my feeling of isolation. So it was a challenging period for me. So I didn't leave with a lot of qualifications, and I ended up going in. My first few jobs were very, entry level, like factory kind of jobs. And it wasn't until I was 20, that I actually got a job. I actually got into the trade. I went to the print trade, and that opened doors for me, really, and avenues which I never saw possible. Even though I was still working in industry, I was involved in the union and started to do bits of training, and the world started to open up a bit more. So by the time I left the trade in my 30s, I actually went to university. So I went in quite late in life, but I went in as 30 plus, and charted a new life for myself. To different degrees. You're talking more current times now. In the 90s, and obviously the early millennia, and the narrative and the way discrimination, I think, it's expressed has changed to some degree. Not absolutely, but there's different. But I wouldn't want to talk about my experiences of university purely in terms of discrimination and prejudice. I did a social science course, really, so we discussed social interaction and the consequences of particular political climate, if you like, and changes over particular periods of time. And certainly prejudice came up in terms of race, but also in terms of other protected characteristics as well. And it was a slightly different debate, because clearly the lecturers on those courses were there to try to inform practice, and certainly because a lot of the people on the course were people going into youth work and community development. I suppose there was much more of a narrative around challenging discrimination. So whatever baggage people came up with, what perceptions people came in with, I think there was much more of a scope to challenge them in that environment. So yes, I think dealing with prejudice and discrimination is part of life. So I would expect to go into any environment where there's a social sciences course, whether it's around art, whether it's around medicine, and to deal with people's perceptions and potentially prejudice and discrimination around the particular groups. But I don't think the experience I had were overtly negative. Well, the voluntary sector is something I've worked in for a number of years now, and I have to say it's been a very positive experience overall. When I came into the sector, I was working within a national organisation who was looking at race specifically, and giving opportunity only to retrain, but to really better understand the dynamics of living in the UK, but also to reflect in a different way and understand other people's experiences. Because one thing, coming into my 20s and having my own experiences as an Afro-Caribbean male, and not being totally ignorant of of the fact that other people have different experiences, but a chance to be able to sit down and study and better understand the whole social dynamic, if you like, and which I suppose my ethnicity is part of that, but to explore that for myself, but also in terms of what other people may be experiences as well. I found working in the voluntary sector has been really an opportunity to learn a lot about different, for myself and other groups of people, and also the challenges they face. So I think when I came into the sector, I still probably to some degree had a feeling of our experiences of minoritized others, whereas now I tend to see it more of that still exists. There's also people whose challenges would be more economic, or people who are dealing with issues around being disabled, or people who are looking around gender and sexuality. So there's a lot of different things which actually sometimes cross over as well. You're not just black or gay or labelled disabled or whatever. You could be all of those, you might be none of those, but you're still having particular challenges. But also there's a lot of people who, whatever they've gone through, thrive. And there's also better understanding that as well, because again, coming into my early 20s and with a lot of baggage, I think it's fair to say, there's a feeling of, again, minoritized others always having to deal with rubbish, having to deal with stuff all the time. And the reality is some of us come out the other end and thrive. And not to say that issues don't go away totally, but you just become much more resilient and informed. I think the diversity in Bhutan is spoken about a lot, and understandably, because it was, long-standing history, like other seaports in the UK, they have a history linked to trade. Wales was obviously a trade centre for the world, over a century ago, and that brought in different population groups. But that has changed over the years, and we've gone from having largely people involved in merchant seamen settling here, and a lot of people settling down with local, largely men, certainly with local women, to some degree people bringing in their families. And that's had its own history, and people talk around Bhutan as being, I suppose, the centre of diversity in Wales. And I can understand that to some degree, but I think there's a diversity in Cardiff which is above and beyond Bhutan. Like I said, I was brought up in Llanrumney, and there was a small number of black families there, and there was a semi-support structure there around that, and I don't know, there wasn't that immediate connection with me being from Bhutan, even though I had some family there and I knew people there and we'd go there from time to time. My life existed outside of Bhutan. And I think that's true of a number of people. Um, and even though I've worked in Bhutan, I know people in Bhutan, I've never really felt part of that circle. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just not been my life. That's the reality of my upbringing. And I'm more than happy to go into Bhutan, and I don't feel the threat that some people allude to sometimes. But also, I think because I live outside of that circle, I view it slightly differently, and as much as I've sometimes see it as the cradle of diversity. And again, I understand that, and I know there's some really positive aspects to its history, and in terms of integration, and some really good things you could take from it. But I'm also aware if there's more contemporary challenges in terms of newer ethnic minority groups coming in, and how they potentially haven't fit in the same way that older Bhutan people have, or at least are recorded of having done, and also the challenges they face with the wider population of Bhutan and other parts of Cardiff. So I think Bhutan's definitely got its place, in the history of Wales, and certainly when you're talking around diversity. But for me, it goes broader than that. And if you really want to understand diversity in Cardiff and Wales, you have to look outside of that model of seafaring folk settling down in an area around the port and a settlement. There are other ways of coming pre, the 90s, and I suppose a lot of people talk around the settlement of the Somali community, or the second wave of Somali community in Bhutan. There were people settling in other parts of Cardiff long before then, and very visible and quite active, and people who've gone on and been now very, very visible and successful. To some degree, there's some really positive stuff going in Cardiff, and certainly, my experience of working with the Black Volunteer Sector Network, there were some really positive things launched at that time. The first the first established Black History Month events, because I know people have done smaller things previous to then. But in earlier, I think it was around 2001, did the first Black History Month events and diversity awards. I've seen how certain organisations have grown and flourished, and obviously some have grown and gone by the wayside for a number of different reasons. I think there's an awareness of the diversity of Cardiff's population. I still don't think is integrated in terms of people telling us the history of Cardiff and naturally having that diversity within it. I think it still tends to be, for the most part, the Cardiff, the Cardiff history, and then there's a diverse history within that, rather than saying, no, this is Cardiff history, and this is represented in all this diversity. I'm not just talking in terms of ethnicity, I'm talking about in terms of other groups as well. Having said that, the Cardiff story, I think, has done quite a good job in terms of getting local people's stories recorded and visible. So I don't have to go there during Black History Month to see something around black people or black groups, which I think is really positive. But I don't think that's necessarily replicated in other parts of the city and in other establishments. So there's been some proaction in terms of really much more broadly representing the diversity of the city. But I think it's only fair to say there's still a long way to go. But I think there are people for me, the most positive thing is there are people from ethnic minority communities and from other diverse groups who are proactive in terms of pushing that agenda. Because I think it's important for us to do that. It's not for us to get lazy and say, oh, it's all sorted, or going towards being sorted, we can take a step back now. I think it's always important for people who have an interest in equality and human rights and positively promoting diversity to be pushing themselves forward and pushing the stories forward, because everybody else is doing that. In terms of wider society, there's always new events to promote, either what's gone on historically, or to promote what's happening now in society, and that should just be part of the norm, I think. And if we can make sure that our stories are told as part of that, and I think that's important. And also from time to time to do something specific, because sometimes that's good as well, to actually say, right, then this is a black event, or this is a minority ethnic community event, and let's celebrate this for now. Because sometimes it's nice taking putting that flavour there and saying, right, then today I'm actually going to eat a Chinese meal. It doesn't always have to be, a mainstream meal. You see what I mean? Sometimes picking things out very specifically is good. And I think it's the attitude, I think, that's important. Impact of Black History Month? Well, I think for the last few years now, there have really been attempts to make a Royal Wales, and there's been much more substantial activity in other parts of Wales. I mean, when I was involved in the early millennia, it was largely, I think it's fair to say, Cardiff and South East Wales focused, with the intention of being much more far-reaching. But I think the partners involved, we weren't successful in terms of getting that broad reach. But I think the more recent incarnation of Black History Month has been successful in terms of getting a much broader reach across Wales. So there's a visibility of Black History Month that wasn't here before. So it's developed substantially, in the last, what would that be, about 12 years. So that's positive. I was glad to be involved in it. And obviously I was involved in the first ones I started in 2001. But it's developed substantially since then, so it would be wrong to say, I've been a pivotal person, because there's been pivotal people and pivotal organisations involved in it. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in that. I would like to see it continue, but I think it does have to evolve, like everything has to evolve to be relevant to the current time and the current political, economic climate. I think Black History Month has always had the aspiration not to be purely for black people, or people who identify themselves as being black. It's always meant to be something that will draw a lot of people into it, with the identification that, black people, one, come from all over the globe, but also don't all look alike. There's an assumption when you say the term black that people would largely look like me. People who have, whose African heritage is very, very visible. And the reality is a lot of people who come from the African subcontinent, or their heritage is from there, who look nothing like me. And there'll be people who to date don't know they have African heritage because it doesn't show. In the same way as my Scottish heritage doesn't show in my features, but it's there. So, the intention was to, I suppose, break down some of the assumptions of what black history is about, but also being very explicit that people who do look like me, or look more like me, have had a particular experience, and we weren't going to shy away with that. Shy away from that. That there's been a particular range of experiences, and also how history has chosen to be recorded, which quite often underrepresents or misrepresents people of African heritage. And there's a lot of negative associations in terms of how our stories, negative experiences of how the story of African peoples have been told. And also to use as celebratory events as well, to really say, as we're trying to go back to the I'm black and I'm proud type statements. So there's an element of being open in terms of bringing other people in, but also in terms of saying, you have a history, people look like me, and to identify with their African heritage. You have a really positive past, and it's an opportunity to embrace that and celebrate that, and even look at some of the negative history and put that in context. Because it's not always about the fact that we have great people. It's also about saying that people have struggled and suffered, but this is the real context of how that struggle and suffering happened. It's not just how that person tells their stories, and other perspectives on that as well. So really to create a rounded environment, to create a rounded discussion around what it means to be black for a range of different people. Everything. Positive and negative. I mean, sometimes it's very easy to say, oh, my life was like this, but then this happened, and then all of a sudden, the veil fell away from my eyes, or I saw the light, or whatever. The reality is, at certain times, sometimes opportunities present themselves, sometimes by accident. Sometimes you just feel more positive about pursuing things that you really want to do. And there's been a number of avenues which has led me to this. So even though I can look at, if I say then I was brought up in quite a negative environment in terms of my ethnicity, and at times, it really adversely affected my life. That has led to me feeling much more positive, because I've had a reason to look at things, to look at my identity, to look at the histories of people who identified as being similar to me. And that has changed over time as well. And to better understand myself, the world I live in, particular political eras. And that's still an interest to me. I'm still learning lots of things. Do you see what I mean? So I don't think I'll ever arrive. I couldn't put my hand on one thing and say, that has led to where I am now. But I think I'm much more opportunist now, in that I feel much more positive about myself, and therefore much more positive about the world around me, and therefore much more able to take on opportunities as they present themselves. Religion, well, I was brought up within a Christian household. My parents were traditional, I suppose. I say traditional. They very strong belief in the Bible. Took a lot of it quite literally. It was a very strong influence in my years growing up. I went to Sunday school, I went to church, I had a strong belief in Christianity growing up. I have to say, when I left the church, it was with a degree of discomfort. I just know it wasn't working for me, but didn't have anything else to move over. So when I left the church, there was a vacuum for me. Because at the end of the day, religion can provide a lot of the answers and rationales for why you should or shouldn't do things, or why we do things. And so it took me a while to be comfortable with the idea, I suppose, of becoming agnostic for most of my adult life. Never really saying I don't believe in any religion. I never became an atheist, but certainly didn't follow a religious path. But I always believed in spirituality, and had I suppose a respect for the idea that religion can be a power for good in the hands of certain people, and there has been a power for good in the hands of certain people. People have really drawn on some of the more humanistic ethos underpinning whatever their religious faith is. So now, I embrace a philosophy which I think supports my feeling of humanity, and so that's important to me. The fact that I found that. I have to say, when I found my philosophy, I didn't feel as if I was searching for anything, but it certainly presented itself to me at a time when I was open to exploring that possibility, and it kind of encapsulates what I feel inside, and I think helps me to build on that substantially. Absolutely. Yeah, gosh, my land of birth, global, I think. I think one thing you could say, probably around the UK now, but certainly in Cardiff, is that you can eat your way around the world in any given week. And I've certainly tried quite a few different different kinds of foods. I mean, I enjoy food. Anybody who knows me know I enjoy food. But certainly I eat food which is from the Caribbean, and I still enjoy having that taste. It's one of those things I think you grow up with, sight, smells, tastes, and some things can create a sense of nostalgia, and I suppose a level of comfort. And I think one of the most positive things of my upbringing was the food. I mean, my mother was I have to say, a phenomenal cook. And I know a lot of people say, my mum's a great cook. My mother was a phenomenal cook, and she made most meals from scratch. I mean, she even baked bread, made lemonade and things like that. So we're not just talking about putting, different meals together from bits and bobs. I mean, she created stuff, a whole table of food from scratch. And I can't do that. like my neighbourhood you can. But Sydney's planted the seed in me in terms of my, I suppose, my taste, and the comfort I get out of eating, I suppose. I think it was something I found comfort in at home. I love eating good Caribbean food. I haven't said I'm probably fussier about what Caribbean food I eat than any other foods, because obviously it's something I grew up with and I have a particular taste for it. But yeah, I do like to eat Caribbean food. I don't cook it particularly well, I have to say. There's certain things I can cook better than others. But my wife cooks, certain Caribbean meals from her country of origin. And I have, sisters. I have two sisters who are particularly good cooks, and they create, the flavors, in their own ways. But yeah, I mean, I have to say, in terms of connection to the Caribbean, I think food is one of the big things for me. And when I have been to the Caribbean, I've been fortunate enough to go to different islands. Exploring the food there has been a real pleasure, and I really enjoy that. Yeah. I think, gosh, that's a big question, because I think people who come to Cardiff have generally contributed, and I think it's not just looking at, I don't know, the big contributions, or even saying we were involved in making roads or putting up buildings, that kind of stuff. I think as long as we've lived and thrived and contributed in terms of going to work, paying our taxes, getting a good education, just living our lives as effectively as possible, I think that's an incredibly important contribution. I think the fact that a number of us have children of different ages who are doing well, feel comfortable in themselves, being brought up with a level of resilience, a strong sense of identity. I think that's fundamentally important. Whether they go on to create great architecture, which stands on the sunset of some river in Wales or the UK, is secondary. If they do that, then brilliant. If they go on and represent, the country in whatever way, in sport or in politics or whatever, great. But I think that comes from building up, educated, intelligent, resourceful, resilient young people. And if somebody goes on and becomes a really good dustman, I know it sounds cheesy, but they can be a really good dustman, but they live a decent life, they can put food on the table for their family, and they're able to raise, children in a good way, then that's a contribution. Yeah, and I think once you create that environment, then invariably you're going to get more Vaughan Gethins. You're going to get more people in politics. You can get more people who are doing well in business. I have a nephew who's 21 and he's gone into architecture, and for me, it fills me with joy because I see a level of resilience in him and an expectation he's going to do well. It's not a case of, as a black man, I am going to try my hardest and strive and show everybody what I can do. To him, he's doing what he can do. He's fulfilling his potential without having to second guess and double think. And potentially in his life, he will come up with stuff that he'll have to deal with as a black male. But hopefully, that will be something he'll deal with as a male who gets treated in a particular way because he's black. Do you see what I mean? Rather than going out there and thinking, oh my goodness, I got to deal with all this stuff. Do you see what I mean? So I think we've made a substantial contribution. The fact that I can look around at people I know, actually people I brought up in Llanrumney, and look at some of their children, and they're confident, they're resilient, they're going to do good things. And to me, that's a big move from my parents who survived, who did their best to keep their heads down because they didn't want to raise themselves above the parapet. They didn't want to get into trouble because they didn't want people to stigmatize themselves, or they didn't want to be stigmatized as typical. Do you see what I mean? So I think, to me, that's quite a telling contribution. In terms of the mixing, well, we're certainly not the same as other parts of the UK, where you get an Afro-Caribbean population here, you get maybe an African, maybe Central African population here, you might get a Bangladeshi population here. Do you see what I mean? I'm not to say none of them ever mix, but there's very clear demarcations with majority cultures in particular areas, and that's reflected in the shops and I suppose the businesses to a large degree. We've not done that history in Cardiff. I suspect probably because of the way the communities have developed here, but also in the fact that we're not that big. Cardiff isn't, we don't have the vast suburbs of Birmingham or London. Um, so to some degree, you're never far away from every other group anyway. You know, if you say, okay, then in Bhutan you've got a very, very diverse, over 50% non-white community. In the more affluent areas, fewer black people. How far away is it? You know, I suppose going from one side to London to another is like going from one side to Wales to another to some degree. Whereas from going from Bhutan to Kincoid, I can cycle there in less than half an hour. Do you see what I mean? So we're never really going to be that separate. Um, so to one degree, I think it's easier for people to integrate. I don't think we've had the political and the more segregationist, I suppose, climate to create that separation. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be affected by the same level of right-wing activity. We don't seem to have had the same experience of right-wing activity in Cardiff. But that's not to say we don't have right-wing activity. It's not to say that we haven't suffered from extreme prejudice, and people have had very extreme experiences living in Cardiff and in Wales. But obviously we tend to focus on Cardiff a lot, but it's not to the same degree. And I would say I'm not 100% sure why. I'm just glad it hasn't happened. But I try not to make it seem as if we're a comfortable melting pot, because I don't think Cardiff is. I think we have a lot of our own problems here, and sometimes the fact that we don't have this visible, strong, political right-wing minority here can paper over the cracks a bit in terms of what the challenges that people face. I know individuals, friends even, who've experienced extreme prejudice and attacks and some really horrible situations. But not to say there's things about Cardiff which are really positive around integration. But like I say, I wouldn't want to paper over the cracks and say, we're one lovely melting pot, everybody's holding hands. Um, I suppose my feeling is that if you're an artist, if you're a painter, if you're a filmmaker, if you're a historian, you present something of quality and something that people will have an interest in, because you present things in a particular way. And I think sometimes, and I understand the history of this, we present things as being a black story, rather than a story which depicts the life of black people or individuals, which has a real human resonance. Do you see what I mean? And maybe the climate is changing where we can start doing that now. Because I think one of the successes of Black History Month is that sometimes people don't know they have a genuine interest or even connection with what's being presented. But I think if things are presented in a particular way, then it draws people in the same way as I can go and see a film, and it may be based in, 15th century China. Yeah? If it's presented in a way, if it's a good storyline, if it's put together with a degree of quality, if it's clear, if it's cohesive, then you can get drawn in, because you get drawn into the human story. If you can see a painting, and sometimes you can look at the painting and you can say that's a load of rubbish. Yeah, I don't even understand what that's about. Particularly, some contemporary art. But you see something else which is equally contemporary, shouldn't make any sense, but to you it makes a connection. Do you see what I mean? And I think it's having that forum to be able to present, I suppose, images, stories, art, culture, and for those who, I suppose, commission or give the go-ahead to show things, they need to be open-minded in terms of saying, right then, I'm not going to just do this in Black History Month. I'm not going to do this around Diwali. I'm not going to just do this around Eid. This is part of a year-round human experience. But also for artists to think of themselves. I'm sure a lot of artists do, actually. I think they tend to get pigeonholed. But it's also for artists to present their stories. and just for them to be considered for that. And I know that I'm potentially speaking idealistically, but I think, in the same way as I can go and see a film or read a book by somebody who really has no connection to me and still be genuinely interested and drawn in and intrigued. I think when people have the opportunity to explore those things, then people just do. They get something out of it. So I suppose it's getting rid of those fake barriers of fake identities, in terms of how things get pigeonholed or genre or put in particular genres, and just giving people a chance to do and to see and to taste. So I suppose that's the job of the museums, if in a sense, is just not to overthink it. They might think, if I do this, are people going to be genuinely interested in the story of a black person? Because that's a minority audience. Well, actually, no, it's a human story. Do you see what I mean? And I think if they do that more, then artists will feel more comfortable, because artists need to sell their wares, if you like. So I think if that environment existed, I think the story should just come through, or the opportunities would just come through. I suppose, in a way, I'm not really sure what that means in terms of they don't know how. They want to have more exhibitions. I suppose there's two elements to that. In terms of depicting more stories from people from, I suppose, indigenous white population, or what is seen as traditional Welsh history, yeah. So, and that's an avenue which is needs to be looked at in terms of incorporating that into the broader Welsh, perspective of Welsh history, yeah. So taking on board, if it might not fit the traditional view of traditional, if that makes sense, but doesn't mean it doesn't have a place. And then putting bums on seats in terms of getting people through the door of for example, St. Fagans. And it's not always about doing something which is about somebody else's culture, explicitly. Do you see what I mean? It's just about making things accessible. When I go to a museum, I mentioned when I go to see a film, when I go to read a book, I don't think, oh, that's about people like me, therefore I'm interested. Oh, that's about other people. I'm not interested. Do you see what I mean? So I suppose to some degree it's about better understanding what brings people to a museum. Yeah, what brings people to see, to look at art. What brings people, and the issue may be more around people's economic status, maybe more around citizen status, maybe much more around what people do in their spare time when they want to do something fun. Do you see what I mean? So it's not actually about, I suppose if we put this exhibition on, well, invariably, if you put an exhibition on about, I don't know, a Muslim writer, you might get a Muslim cohort in for a day because they say, oh, they're going to launch this new thing, and they come in and say, yay, and then you go back to your general museum or bookshop, clientele. Do you see what I mean? So I don't think it's a simple answer. I think it's far better understanding your audiences rather than saying, if I do something which is fits in this genre, everybody's going to come along.